welcome back on stage. Welcome back to this room. I hope you had a great lunch break. I hope you had time to talk to your peers, to have some food, to have some coffee, maybe even catch some fresh air, even though it's raining outside. I know, I saw it. But great that you're all here. Very happy to see the faces that I saw before. And to start this block of panels and fireside chats and keynotes, I am very happy to introduce the next panel, and we are going back to the topic of cognitive warfare, but this time we're actually going to focus on the cross-sectoral cooperation and resilience, because cognitive warfare by itself is no longer a regional phenomenon. It is not really confined to war zones across the world. It is a global challenge, really. It is affecting democratic societies, it is affecting institutions, it is affecting alliances, basically everything that we see in our lives. And the challenge today is not limited to just countering falsehoods and debunking myths, whatever you call it. We do need governments and defense sector actors and their partners to come together to build better structural defensive mechanisms against cognitive warfare. And I have here just the people to talk about all this and share the best practices on this topic. Please help me in welcoming on this stage our next panel. First panelist is Emma Winberg, the founder and CEO at Next Level Initiatives. She has over 15 years of experience in some of the world's most complex and conflict-affected environments, including Syria and Gaza, in Iraq and Somalia. She has been a banker, a management consultant, a diplomat, a stratcom specialist, and so many other things. Right now, Emma is building Next Level Initiatives, where she is pursuing her vision for a new model for integrated civic mobilization that supports a whole-of-society response to global threats. Next up, our old friend Peter Pomeranzev, who's already been on this stage today, senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, an accomplished journalist, an author, a researcher, an author of 3 books, who is now writing the 4th, right? So in his research, Peter focuses on engaging audiences vulnerable to propaganda and disinformation. Next up, Torsten Hertig, the CEO at Discourse. Torsten has experience working at the Danish MOD as an analyst, and he advised the EU advisory mission in Ukraine in 2022. And now he is building Discourse, which is a cognitive warfare company that's very hard to find anything about online. And I just asked him backstage why that is so, and he was, yeah, that's exactly the idea, that's why. So I really hope to hear more about it. And to moderate it all, we have on this stage, once again, Valentyna Shapovalova, the analyst at Defense Innovation Highway, experienced in coordinating the collaboration between Ukraine and the Nordics as she develops and coordinates initiatives in cognitive warfare and defense. So please do enjoy the conversation. Give a big round of applause to this panel, and the floor is all yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming back after lunch. And I mean, we already talked about cognitive warfare once on this stage, and now we're going to do it again. But the first time was from more Ukrainian perspective. This time we're going to take a global look. We're going to broaden it outside of the Ukrainian borders. And to help me with that and to make me smarter, that's a very Danish expression, are 3 absolutely amazing panelists who are going to give us 3 different perspectives on this question. The first, of course, Peter. Emma asked me to introduce Peter as a thought leader, and I don't think it's wrong.
Ooh, okay. That's unforgivable, all right. Okay.
But it is...
I do have a real job.
Peter is one of the leading experts on Russian propaganda and the information sphere I mean, globally, I was going to say in the Western world, but who is there other than you? On the globe, I don't know. Then we have Torsten, who will present the more commercial side of things, the more commercial perspective on this topic. And Emma will give us the non-governmental, non-commercial perspectives. And we'll start with this quite broad question, but what is Europe getting wrong about cognitive warfare in 2026?
I think an important question also to raise is whenever we talk about it, we talk about what's going wrong. I think there's actually also a lot of things that's going right. I founded the company in 22 And when we started up having to basically try and convince governments that we shouldn't just be, instead of just analyzing all the campaigns that were targeting us, we should also campaign the other way. We should also try and tell every Russian that the war is a bad war and get people to apply pressure on the Kremlin. We should try to get people not to sign up to the army and so on. It was a real uphill battle, and I think a lot of things have changed now. I think there's a lot more frameworks. There's a lot more governments who are saying we do want to get into this. Capabilities has been built as well. So I think when we started, a lot of it was about we had to both be running the projects and telling whoever we're working with how to do measurements, how to do a framework that we could bid for, and so on. And we don't have to do that anymore. I think there's plenty of European governments. Donald Trump has been really helpful in making European governments take it more seriously. So I think there's also a lot of things that are going right in the sense that there's just many more actors are getting into the space. More money is going to the space. More professionalism, really.
So I'm going to take a bit more of a bearish view on cognitive warfare, which is I don't think anyone's really defined what it means. And at the moment, it's being used as a sort of unholy mashup for stratcoms, psychological operations, information operations, influence operations, and the rest of it. And that lack of clarity leads to potentially a risk where we see this as a sector on its own, much like we've seen, for example, the handling of the war against terror, the war against disinformation, the Global Engagement Center, and the kind of the realm of public diplomacy, etc. It limits our options, and it fundamentally reduces our effectiveness because it takes information as a sphere in itself. Whereas, in fact, I know Torsten maybe want to contradict me on this one. This needs to be, when we talk about cognitive warfare, we're talking about cognitive effects, and they depend on a simple question. Who are we trying to influence, and what is it we want them to do? So first, before we do anything, we need to decide that, and then work backwards from an understanding of what motivates that person, or people, or structures, or systems. I don't really see that debate taking place, partly because I think in a war like the one we're currently in, where we are relying on quite a large constellation of different countries and states with different appetites and views, it is quite hard to form a consensus on what needs to happen. And so I think in terms of when we talk about cognitive warfare, if what we're really trying to do is change the dial and defend Ukraine, constrain Russia, then the first thing we ought to start with is determining what that end state looks like and then building a plan towards it.
I don't actually think you need a consensus. I think it's fine to have different actors going at different targets, or even the same targets from different angles. Some have more appetite, some have less appetite. I think the way I see it, and I think the way it should be, is think about it as a question of saying what kind of company needs PR. It's basically every company needs some PR, and I think it's the same with government. I think whenever we do military support for Ukraine or build up our own military capacity, there should be somebody raising a question saying how we're communicating about this, how we're telling our enemies about what we're doing. Whenever we are getting attacked in the cognitive space, we should also think about, okay, how do we respond to it? We're also talking about, well, for example, I think it's a shame right now that a big theme here in Denmark is the shadow fleet. So the Russian tankers going through Danish waters with oil that's used to fund the war against Ukraine and the military buildup that's going to hit us at some point. Well, Sweden is actually right now boarding some of these tankers. They should have planned a lot more comms around it, I think. And I think that's how you should think into it, that you can... It's an add-on to basically almost everything you do militarily.
Do we need a consensus, Peter, in this field?
We do need to be able to explain to our own populations why it's important. So to give yourself the options for all kinds of activity, you do need to keep, your own people on board. And so I've been doing quite a lot of polling and various types of sort of message testing over the last years and working with others who are doing the same thing. Not always in Europe, but across the world. And, you know, when you frame it as cognitive threats or even propaganda, most people don't care. They largely think everybody does it. They largely think that they're immune. They might start caring if it's their kids. They're like, oh, your kids are under the influence of XXX. Then they wake up. But once you explain to people that Russia and its proxies are hitting your critical infrastructure, that they are hacking your hospitals, that they are creating supply chains that make your public transport vulnerable to disruption, then people wake up very, very fast. So the first thing we need a much better job of attributing activity to Russia, and only around 20% of Russian, let's just call it biting and scratching, of Russian kind of like nasty activities are attributed to Russia. So we need to get much better at attributing what they're doing and explaining to people why it matters to them. Simply saying there's a cognitive war on is very abstract. So we have to get much better at communicating, you know, the threat. And that's only half of it, though. You know, as every government official knows, you can't just talk about threats without saying what you're going to do. And this was from sort of polling and research I looked at in America that some partners I know were doing. You know, Americans, for example, once they became aware of the threats, they wanted to know, what are we doing? They wanted to be told a story. They were like, who's our James Bond? Where's our super cyber force that's going to react to this? What are we going to do to them? So you need the whole thing. You need to explain the threats, why they matter to people, not in an abstract way, but in an effects way that affects their lives. And then you need to be showing what we're going to do, which means rebuilding or building a whole bunch of capabilities and the storytelling around that. So we're kind of missing both of those pieces. At the moment, what I do think we have progress on is elites, whether it's the head of SIS, Blaise Metrabelli, or Martin Jäger at the BND, saying Russia is in a hybrid war with us. People listen up and they're like, okay, what? Who? What? And then there's no follow-up. It's also going to take a lot of bravery from intelligence agencies to start revealing a lot more data. I mean, these are big changes that need to happen. But if we want to have options, if we want to start competing in this space, we're going to have to bring society along. Partly because defense in this space is all of society. So it's not something that can be dealt with in smoky corridors. It's something where all of society, business, education, civil society all have to be involved.
Yeah.
On that, it's an interesting point. I mean, you're talking about the role of intelligence services, for example, and security services and being more transparent. There's always been a trouble for government. To declassify information takes time. Often these, by the time they've been able to respond, the thing has long passed, has become memes, has been taken advantage of, etc. I think equally important is to look at the opportunities that can be found in open source. I say that in inverted commas because it's become a kind of quite a loosely termed expression. If you look at what is considered open source in Russia right now, it's basically what can you get hold of and at what price, because so much is traded commercially in terms of private information or personal information or corporate information. But if we look at the open source sector, there is a lot that can be done up to a threshold of sensitivity where we can lighten the load. And I think this is what we've seen as an organization that supports independent investigative media. Looking at, for example, a couple of the organizations we support have released stories in the past year which have exposed Russian intelligence operations in Europe. Now, these are civil society organizations that are able to perform not exactly the same job as intelligence services, and nor should they, but they've played an important public benefit role in exposing Russian operations, and that is starting to materially change the position that Europeans hold with regard to their own deterrence, their own desire for a preparedness strategy, and a recognition of the threat that Russia poses. So I suppose the point I would make is that I think there is a new construct where Ukraine has really led the way. I think you mentioned it in your previous panel. The degree to which civil society and commercial companies play a role in the war effort is extraordinary and unprecedented. I believe that we can do the same thing in Europe and thereby scale the response, which I think this is a subject that we probably ought to talk about, is how do we scale in this cognitive warfare? How do we scale organizations like Torsten's? And maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, how do we scale?
How do we
organizations
scale, you
like yours?
I think
Money.
maybe a big thing is actually to we need to be much more courageous about it. So as you say, Peter, there's this movement within elites, but there's also a lot of pushback from bureaucracies. And I think a real troubling thing for most governments is that they think, this is something that should be within the intelligence services. But a big problem is that a lot of it is happening online. And try to explain. I often feel like you have to explain intelligence services how the internet works, because they're not allowed to be on TikTok. They rarely use social media. So all of this goes on we're using platforms, we're using dynamics, we're using online tools that are just off limit to them. And that's not to say that they can't work with it, but I think it's just a bit of a blind side that you think this is something that they'd be able to push into, but actually really, really badly put to it. So either you need to have sort of like not as hardcore intelligence services, or just some new structures that are much more comms orientated than intelligence services are, because they're usually always the opposite.
But who should the courageous ones then be? Should it be coming from the state, from the bureaucrats?
Yeah, I think it should be somewhere between the foreign ministry and the intelligence, I guess. is where it should sit. It's not diplomatic work, because it is defense related. I mean, we are essentially trying to harm our enemies. But one thought of it, it is probably the intelligence services, but they just need to be more aware of these blind sides that's in it, because it's all happening on platforms that our kids know a lot about, and that intelligence services know very little about.
But how do we?
So the kids should be scaling it, is what you're basically saying.
The kids should be scaling
It's
it.
like,
They know how
release
to
our 13-year-olds.
Child labor.
Yeah.
No. That's off record. But how do we fight the bureaucrats?
What?
Peter, in this space, because it is a conversation that I had with Torsten, and you've also complained about them. How?
Have I?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of my best friends are bureaucrats. Okay.
But within this space, because it is a real hurdle to some of the work that is being done, in the sense that it slows things down. And
right.
In the work that, again, is being made by the civil society actors. I mean, obviously, especially in Ukraine, but also commercial actors. How do we work around the bureaucratic hurdles in scaling this work?
I mean, look, this is not a new problem. Somewhere around mid-1941, a furious, very senior British bureaucrat, the former ambassador to Moscow, Sir Stafford Cripps, I think. I'm getting the names confused. Anyway, a man who was seen as like possibly displacing Churchill when Churchill was in trouble, storms into the foreign minister's office, outraged, screaming at him that it turns out that the British are using sadomasochistic pornography to undermine the morale of German troops. And he discovered that the British were broadcasting these sort of secret, covert, pirate radio stations that were, even today read as really quite the most graphic sadomasochistic orgies of Nazi officials and various German individuals. And he sort of storms in saying, like, what on earth are we doing? If we win the war through this sort of methodology, I'd rather we lose it. This is disgusting. And what happens next, and it's in my last book, if you want to read it, How to Win an Information War, came out last year. What happens next is incredible exchange of letters, which are in the archives, where the people who are creating this subversive cognitive warfare basically have to argue why they're using sadomasochistic porn to subvert the Germans. And the arguments they make are the Germans are all perverts, and this is the only kind of pornography they understand. This is the only thing that will get in. Hold on, the idea that the British aren't into sadomasochism. Have you heard of boarding schools? I mean, like it's called the English disease for a reason. I mean, the idea this is something German is funny, but then more substantively, this is getting the audiences in. This is actually effective comms. The BBC, meanwhile, was doing, Thomas Mann's lectures on the virtues of democracy. These guys were saying, no, we want to get German soldiers to listen. This is ruining morale. This is getting them to defect. It's effects-driven. It's working. And they had the data to back that up. And in the end, they convinced sort of Eden, the foreign minister, and Churchill, ultimately, that this is necessary. And they win the argument. I mean, the reason I talk about this is, look, it is about effect. At one point you get into, is this working? There are always going to be costs. There are always going to be dangers. It was probably a blow to some sort of British reputation that we were using this sort of pornography, but the effects are more important. So, it is about thinking about what are we trying to achieve? What is the political will? What are we trying to get to? And I do actually think we're very blessed these days, in the sense that we are a coalition, a constellation of allies from Ukraine through to my poor, bedraggled Britain. And we can distribute our risks. We're in a very privileged position, actually, where Ukraine has a much higher risk threshold. And I don't think it's going to be much of a scandal in the Zelensky government if they get caught using some sort of, subversive methods. While maybe for a country as moral, as upstanding, as free of any kind of pornography as Denmark, could contribute in another way through research, audience analysis, diplomacy. So let's really think about that. We're in a very lucky place that we can really mix and match, think about risk, the risks involved in any kind of activity, and spread those risks a little bit.
Yeah, Emma?
I mean, I think the point you're making actually addresses the issue in a very roundabout kind of way that we raised earlier about.
It is after lunch. We need to wake people up.
Yes, true. Do we need to have consensus? And the idea is, can we just lean towards the most forward-leaning? Can we go with whoever? Everybody's talking about Europe being impossibly slow, not least the Ukrainians who are deeply frustrated with us. Danes are obviously leading the way, but nonetheless, things are moving too slowly. Is it possible to go with the speed of the fastest rather than the common denominator, which is always the speed of the slowest? Maybe it is. Maybe it's enough to have a vague sense of a common direction in all of this. I think the thing that when it comes to risk appetite, though, consistently since the beginning of this, after the full-scale invasion, we have been pushing against a perception that information operations, cognitive operations, psychological operations are somehow more risky than dropping a bomb inside Russia. Which, when we talk about this stuff, people are like, ooh, that's edgy stuff you're doing. We're like, what? You make drones? Apparently it is, and it really upsets the Russians. That said, what we need to think about here when we're deciding whether we go and do some homoerotic, whatever it is you're doing, sadomasochistic, something else, on torrent, or whatever it is we're choosing for this, the argument has to be, this is, even if it's a risk, it's a different kind of risk than the risk of having to go into war, where sometimes we have to do slightly ugly things in order to preserve the beautiful thing. And the beautiful thing, this is when we keep having the question of, but doesn't this stuff undermine who we are? Aren't we supposed to be better than that? We're not supposed to be like them. They do disinformation. They do propaganda. We do the truth. We're noble. There isn't necessarily a great nobility in losing in this case. And if this can materially contribute to what is a scarce set of resources that we're fighting with in a pretty asymmetric war, I think we're all, the people at least on this stage, are all pretty forward-leaning to say, yes, we should do it and we should lean into it.
And I think also it's really, I think it is happening now that it's a new area, it's a new thing, it's incredibly cost effective, doesn't cost much, and it does have a great effect. We can measure the effect as well, just because of modern technology, and the fact that all our enemies is basically connected to us via the internet. But obviously there's just a period where you have to go through figuring out, okay, what's the ethical boundaries here? Our enemy is lying all the time. Can we do this without lying? Or if we do have to lie, how much can we do it? One thing that we're always saying is, we don't want to promote information that's not true. But if we want to get into the Russian information space, the way to get it there is by using fake profiles. Because if we start, doing an advertisement campaign as the European Union telling soldiers not to join the army, it's going to be closed down immediately. So we have to pretend that we are something else, and just get some kind of acceptance, or not acceptance, but get kind of. I think you need to have the ethical framework for how you're going to do it. But then it's really just pushing ahead, and then I think that's kind of.
Isn't that point though? There's a really interesting point here about the parameters of what is acceptable in wartime and peacetime, because military deception is a thing. It's literally a thing. It has a doctrine. Like that's perfectly fine to lie to your enemy in order to put them in a place where you can. That's fine, but it's not fine. Disinformation is not fine when it's there to alter the perception of a population. For example, I think Valentyna raised a question earlier, which was about what would be helpful to foster a kind of more effective cognitive warfare environment. I think one of the things we've talked about is steady financing. You've talked about demand signals. Maybe you can go into that a bit more because I think that's quite useful for this audience. But also political permissions, ethical frameworks, so that then you can let people get on with stuff and be creative.
Yeah, there was more just something we were discussing about. I think also the thing about it is it's compared to most other defense sectors, this is incredibly cheap. You can run an effective anti-recruitment campaign in Russia for, let's say, you can probably do it for 20,000 euros a month. I don't know how that stacks up against the missiles you would usually be buying in the military. It's incredibly cheap. But what you need to do is you need to have the demand needs to come from governments, which means that somebody on the inside needs to start building the frameworks for how we're going to hire companies to do it. Are we going to do it ourselves? Are we going to do it with civil society? Also set some ambitious targets for it, which I think has been lacking a bit in generally how we in Europe have been thinking about the world. There's been loads of missed opportunities where we could have done a lot more PR, basically just to humiliate our enemies, but our focus wasn't on it. We didn't think 2 years ago that it was our job to stop recruitment to the Russian military. I think there's a sense still that we think that it's not really our job to make it more difficult for the Russian nuclear fleet to work, but it is because it's targeting against us. So we should do everything we can not to make it work. And cognitive warfare is just a place where you can, again, it's not going to be the only thing you're going to be doing. You're going to get a lot of bang for your buck if you invest in it.
I still have questions, but we have run out of time. You can catch these amazing people that I barely had to moderate because you're a waterfall. It's amazing. Thank you so much to the audience and to our panelists.
Thanks.